Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising to speak to Bill C-31 today, a Budget Implementation Act. As always seems to be the case, the government, using their majority for purposes that are less than democratic, has limited debate on this bill. For the fifth time, Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government has done its best to evade parliamentary scrutiny of what it puts forward as an economic agenda through time allocation. I'm lucky enough to get my thoughts on the floor today, just before debate closes. But, Mr. Speaker, my thoughts on this bill are not kind ones. And, of course, the conduct of this government, its approach to the business of this House, does not incline any of us to be particularly charitable. Some have described the budget and C-31 as substantially irrelevant documents. Not so, Mr. Speaker. Parts herein are quite stunning. I'm not sure whether they're stunning in their audacity or stunning in their timidity, but stunning nevertheless, Mr. Speaker. What Canadian could have imagined the surrender of sovereignty and betrayal of citizenship that is bound up in the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, FATCA as it's known, and buried deep amongst 500 clauses in over 350 pages? As I just found out from my colleague from Timmins, it's on page 99 of a 350-page document. But what characterizes this bill as a whole, Mr. Speaker, is incoherence. One might argue that that is the nature of the omnibus bill. They are certainly fundamentally undemocratic beasts, but I think, Mr. Speaker, there's something else going on here in addition. This bill betrays a government bereft of any understanding of this country in its complicated entirety in this century, much less this year, 2014. 8 years into power, and this government still doesn't see the urban fact of this country. The fact that over 80% of Canadians live in urban communities, from downtowns to suburbs and places in between. It still governs like this isn't true of Canada. It doesn't understand the relationship of Canada's cities to the rural and resource economies that surround them and the opportunities that flow from that relationship. It still governs like these are separate and unrelated economies, separate and unrelated environments, separate and unrelated societies. It still governs, in fact, as though urban economies, environments, and communities don't exist, much less have their own peculiarities and needs and present their own and great opportunities for this country. And it does not grasp the relationship between our cities and the rest of the world, to the global economy. It still governs as though the federal government is our only interface between Canada and the global economy, failing to grasp that what defines the global economy is a network of urban economies, a network into which our cities from coast to coast to coast are connected, and increasingly so. This was a budget and a Budget Implementation Act that contains no plan for Canada through its cities to succeed in a global economy. Let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, about what my city of Toronto needs to succeed at a minimum. Toronto grows by 100,000 people every year. We add to the population of our city, and by city I'm speaking about our city region, not the municipality per se. We add to the population of that city a city the size of Calgary or Ottawa every decade. According to the Conference Board of Canada, an economic growth rate of 2.5% annually is required just to keep up with that pace of population growth. And that growth rate must also be distributed evenly, but it isn't. Says the Toronto Region Board of Trade, quote, "The 21st century city-region economy is creating a new kind of urban social structure. It consists on one side of well-paid, highly qualified professional and technical workers, and on the other, an increasingly precarious and growing proportion of low-wage, service-oriented workers." Recent studies, Mr. Speaker, by the United Way and McMaster University, by the Institute of Competitiveness and Prosperity and the Martin Prosperity Institute, by the Metcalf Foundation, all of which I've referenced in this House before, point to the growth of precarious employment in Toronto's labour market and confirm the emergence of this polarized labour market and consequent social structure in Toronto. Even closer to my home and to my riding of Beaches East York, Mr. Speaker, a recent study entitled Economic Survival Strategies of Immigrant Communities in Toronto captured the extent of the shadow economy. Half of the respondents in that survey reported getting paid less than minimum wage. Over one-third of respondents didn't get vacation pay, statutory holiday pay, or paid holidays of any kind, Mr. Speaker. So we are witnessing a city once admired for its mixed-income neighborhoods, dividing into a city of low-income neighborhoods and high-income neighborhoods. In 1970, two-thirds of Toronto's cities were middle-income neighborhoods. As of 2005, 29% were middle-income. Extrapolating that trend out to 2025, it's the story of a sharply polarizing city where less than 10% of Toronto's neighborhoods will be middle-income, just over a decade from now. But long before we get there, and in fact now, we have a critical housing challenge that needs to be addressed. In those low-income neighborhoods, such as some in my riding, where the shadow economies thrive, and I quote, "Inadequate housing and the risk of homelessness are almost universal amongst families with children living in high-rise apartments," says a March 2014 study by Parity, Wilson, and Logan for the City Centre at the University of Toronto. Quote, "Almost 90% face major housing problems that may place them at risk of homelessness. One family in three is facing severe or critical risk of homelessness," says the study. According to the Toronto Region Board of Trade, the state of good repair bill for the city's housing units is $750 million and growing by $100 million a year. Meanwhile, the city's accumulated state of good repair backlog in 2012 was $1.7 billion. There is an enormous challenge here that this government is shrinking from, or is blind to, as it continues down the path of extricating the federal government from affordable housing in this country. The same holds true of public transit. I asked the Minister of Infrastructure just yesterday why this government is refusing to invest in public transit. The answer, and I quote from Hansard, Mr. Speaker, was, "Our government respects the jurisdictions of provinces and transit is under provincial jurisdiction," end quote. That, Mr. Speaker, is the response of this government to the key economic challenge of Canada's global cities. It's not our responsibility. Study after study after study, Mr. Speaker, point to the economic costs of underinvestment in transit in Toronto and the consequent stifling gridlock. Quote, "Overstretched transportation networks are the most serious barrier to economic growth in the Toronto region, costing our regional economy $6 billion per year," says the Toronto Board of Trade. The C.D. Howe Institute pegs the current economic costs at closer to $11 billion. Either way, the economic cost of underinvestment in transit is enormous, compromising the competitive position of Toronto, and they are expected to go up. And they are a stinging indictment of this government's blindness to the needs of cities and to the opportunity to grow our urban economies that is there, waiting there for a government alive to simply the urban fact of this country and the reality of a global and increasingly globalizing economy. It's very simple, Mr. Speaker. The success of our cities is vital to our national interest, and Canada needs a national agenda that is alive to our urban reality, to how cities work, their needs, their vulnerabilities, and their potential. Getting our cities right opens up the possibility that we hope for ourselves, for our families, and for Canada. The only thing that's clear about C-31 is that this government doesn't get that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.